To get things started, I'm just going to introduce you right away to Gwyneth Doan.
Good evening and welcome. I'm a board member of the Victoria Festival of Authors, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Victoria Festival to Dark Woods and Open Water, featuring Jennifer Manuel, Daryl McLeod, and Elisa York. The Victoria Festival of Authors and Langham Court Theatre are located on the traditional ancestral territories of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. Tonight we begin by acknowledging with respect and with gratitude the ancestors, hereditary leaders, and matriarchs, as well as the creators from these lands. We give thanks for the privilege of living and working here, and are committed to serving as learners and as listeners. We also want to begin with a thank you to our sponsors, the Canadian Council of the Arts, the CRD, the City of Victoria, and the Victoria Foundation, and of course Langham Court Theatre for hosting us, the Walrus and the Rose Books. Thanks also to the Writers' Union of Canada, who has sponsored Daryl and Jennifer's appearance at our festival. Thank you to Mo's Home Collection and Poppy's Floral Art for providing our wonderful staging that offers a welcoming setting for tonight's event. So just a few little housekeeping things. There will be a 15-minute intermission midway through the evening. The concession will be open during that time, but please note that no drinks or beverages are allowed into the theater, so you'll have to finish them before you come back in. There are also 2 gender-neutral bathrooms across the hall. Closed captioning is provided and can be accessed through your phone or tablet. Please ask a volunteer for the Wi-Fi password and URL link. At the end of the event, books will be available for purchase and for signing by the authors. Tonight's panel is hosted and moderated by Nicholas Bradley. And so now I'm going to just introduce Nicholas. Nicholas is a poet, a literary critic, and a scholarly editor. He teaches Canadian literature and environmental writing in the Department of English at the University of Victoria. And as a particular focus of his work, which I found really intriguing, is how landscapes and environments are imagined by writers and how writers respond to what we think of as the natural world. Nicholas is the author of 2 books of poetry, Rain Shadow and Before Combustion. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas and welcome the panel, and hope you enjoy the evening.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Dark Woods and Open Water. My name is Nicholas Bradley, and I'm the moderator for tonight's event, which features 3 wonderful authors, Daryl McLeod, Jennifer Manuel, and Elisa York. And tonight will be an evening of fiction that portrays life in small communities in BC. That's what's brought these 3 authors together. I'd like to begin by thanking the authors for being here, by thanking you, the audience, for being here, whether live or streaming, and by thanking the staff and the volunteers of the Victoria Festival of Authors for making everything possible, and especially the festival producer, Laura Trunke, for her heroic efforts in taking care of all of the logistics and coordinating all the participants, which I'm sure is like herding cats and pushing string, probably both at the same time. Our plan for this evening is as follows. I'll introduce all 3 writers in the order in which their names appear in the program, and then the authors will read from their new books. Then we'll have a brief intermission, after which I'll ask our authors some questions about their books and the people and places they depict. And finally, we'll have some time for questions from the audience. And I'm sure that you will have many questions, hint, hint. But mostly, I'll do my best to get out of the way so that we can hear from tonight's readers. So first tonight will be Jennifer Manuel, who is an acclaimed novelist who won the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize for her debut novel, The Heaviness of Things That Float, from 2016. A longtime activist in Indigenous issues, she taught elementary and high school in the lands of the Tahltan and Nuchanoth peoples. Her new book is The Morning Bell Brings the Broken-Hearted. One reviewer of the novel praised Manuel's rich prose that glides easily between forthright description, poetic similes, and lyric beauty. And another review in the Vancouver Sun observed that Manuel writes eloquent and lyrically beautiful sentences and evokes both the menace and grandeur of the coastal rainforest and the sorrowful complexity of human connections throughout the novel. Jennifer lives here on Vancouver Island in Duncan. Next will be Darrell J. McLeod, who is a Nehiyaw writer from Northern Canada from Treaty 8 territory. He worked as an educator, chief negotiator of land claims for the federal government, and executive director of education and international affairs with the Assembly of First Nations. His brand new novel, A Season in Chesgun, follows his memoirs Mamaskatch, which won the Governor General's Award, and Payakau. He holds degrees in French literature and education from the University of British Columbia. He lives in Souk, where he divides his time between writing and, I just read this on his publisher's website, singing in a jazz band, so please ask him about that later. And then finally tonight we'll hear from Elisa York, whose internationally acclaimed novels include Mercy, Effigy, which was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize, Fauna, and The Naturalist, which won the Canadian Authors Association Fiction Award. Her most recent novel, Far Cry, was partly inspired by time she spent as a child with her dad in a skiff off the BC coast, which is a detail that every writer wishes they could have in their bio. The review in the Toronto Star says that with Far Cry, Elisa York has written what is surely one of the finest novels of the year, an astonishing and immersive journey that will leave its readers reeling and raving to anyone who will listen. Elisa now makes her home in Toronto and teaches creative writing at the Humber School for Writers. So with that, I will turn things over to our first reader tonight, Jennifer Manuel.
Thank you very much. This starts with a little epigram at the beginning. Teacher, teacher, let me in. My feet are cold. My shoes are thin. If you do not let me in, I'll knock your window outside in. From the front door of my gray trailer home, my commute across the old logging road to the school took precisely 46 steps. 46 steps I no longer wanted to take. 46 steps I counted every dreaded morning to keep from thinking about those children and my failures and my desire to be back home and my mistaken belief that I had what it took to be a teacher in a place like this. 46 steps that I counted to keep from thinking about the rainforests that loomed all around me. It was on blustery mornings like this one, when the forest seemed charged with an awakening, as though it stirred with the stories I had obsessed over as a child. Stories of forests riddled with darkness and deceit, where beautiful flowers were promised to red-cloaked girls if only they went farther into its depths, where witches cast spells to make it always winter but never Christmas, where wolves waited in disguise and crones lured children with the things their hearts longed for, things no one in this world could ever give them. At the end of the dirt path from my porch, my boots crunched onto the gravel of the old logging road, the sound muffled by the roar of the wind through the cedars, and as the pages of my students' notebooks riffled under my coat sleeve, I felt a sudden chill. My eyes darted to the trees in spite of my counting. Since arriving in Tawakin last month at the beginning of September, that forest had haunted me. Why this was, I could not say. There was, of course, my natural concern for the creatures that roam there, the black bears and the cougars. I halted in the middle of the logging road at the thought of this, my boots skidding slightly. A small spray of pebbles bounced and rattled, and in the quiet that followed, I checked for any signs of movement around me. The empty logging road snaked between the small cluster of the teachers' homes and down the hill to the shoreline of the tiny New Chelmsford village. 25 houses, the colors of blue jays and daffodils and ferns, woven into the rainforest on a remote northwest corner of Vancouver Island, stitched to the rest of the world by only air and water and the satellite signals captured by the gray discs mounted on every roof. Beyond, the Pacific Ocean stretched out to the horizon, marked with thin lines of white-crested waves, dotted with small islands of cedar and sharp stone, a few of them visible from here above the village on clear days if you look past the descending treetops of the forest. Gazing over the ragged fringe of hillside cedars was the closest I ever wished to come to exploring the forest, while I had used every shred of rational thought to fight off my fear of what might lurk inside there. I had no intention of ever stepping into that darkness. Its undergrowth thorny and tangled, its canopy so thick not even the sun could guide your way, each fibrous giant connected, as if by magic, through a fungal subterranean circuit, like the neural pathways of our own minds, able to warn one another of threats and dangers, or perhaps whisper an enchanted wisha, wisha, wisha into its shadowy maze. If I were to believe the folk tales that consumed me as a child, then I knew a person could lose themselves in the dark woods if they weren't careful. In there, evil forever chased, the good forever fled. Children forever dared one another to enter. Deep enough inside for us to realize that the woods played with children as much as children played with the woods. Each night I drew small portraits of my students, 4 or 5 sketches overlapping one another on a single page, as I tried to capture them from different angles, in different lights, different moods. I kept my sketchbook underneath a Japanese fishing float on the windowsill among the abalone and moon snail shells, the clam shells filled with beach glass and willow charcoal sticks. My artist mother told me as a child that charcoal was for big sketches, sketches intended to create the illusion of motion and vector, but I loved how the rough lines and the smudges of black dust opened my yolk-sized portraits to interpretation like tiny ink blots. Whether it was the lack of realism and definition I embraced or the ability to inject my interpretations with hope, I did not know. But as I sketched my students' portraits that evening, I found myself searching their faces for cracks of innocence, traces of what was once whole among all those broken lines, as if their true child selves were buried somewhere beneath the frowns and the scowls and the furrowed brows, the cruel smirks, the seemingly unkind intentions, the scathing mockery of everything, the immeasurable hurt, the angry blood rushing out of their broken hearts. Once again, that nagging thought sprang to my mind. Quit. Quit this job. Just quit and pack your belongings and go back to the city. But what would my friends think of me? Would they even believe it if I told them how in the first month, just the first month of teaching in Tawalkin had taken the ground out from under my feet? And it wasn't just Hannah Charlie. There was Candace Henry and her photograph of her father drowned in the Pacific, her mother living on a beach somewhere in Port Hardy. There was Odelia and her father, who had been kicked out of the village for something only said in whispers. There was Kenny and his mother, who had obliterated their television with a shotgun one night 2 weeks ago. Even those children who sometimes laughed quietly at my jokes or flashed a small smile when they understood a math problem or showed a hint of excitement for an art project, even those children erected walls around themselves that left me believing I could never teach them in a way that would make a difference. As I roughed out the structure of Hannah's face, I rubbed the charcoal until the lines of her face became soft and peaceful, a vision of what I dreamed she might become. Normally, the more serenity I depicted in her face each night, the more my feeling of defeat and futility faded. Tonight, though, no amount of alterations seemed to lift up my spirits. After school, the principal, Mr. Chapman, had asked me to fill out an incident report, which I did while John, the school custodian and maintenance worker, picked bits of glass off the counter. Turns out Hannah had spent the rest of the day in Mr. Chapman's office, where they played checkers, and he promised to move her onto learning chess in the school's chess club if she in turn promised to never hurl furniture in the school again. I could leave here tomorrow or next week or at the start of Christmas holidays, wishing everyone felicitations only to never return. And what would it matter? Even if I felt shame for leaving, I would never have to see any of these people again. It was almost midnight by the time I had drawn over half the class. Where mouths turned down in actuality, I had curved lines upward. Where shadows darkened their eyes, I had depicted light. Where eyelids drooped in apathy, I had lifted their gaze wide. Where expressions showed fear, I had injected hope. As I leaned back and stared at my work, it occurred to me that some might think it dangerous to contort my students' reality in this way. But over the past month, my sketchbook had become a rock of faith, a source of strength, and it was at nightfall when I needed this the most. It was at nightfall when I felt most uncertain about living on an edge of the world where dark rainforest met ocean, the precise place where two unknowable things came together. It was at nightfall when the darkening forest left me alone with my uneasiness, my mind going over the day, trying to figure out how I could out-teach the broken lines, the frowns, the fears. That was when the strange light changed the cedars and the firs into creatures that seemed almost heartbreaking to me in their hugeness and their sense of purpose. Thank you.
Our next reader is Daryl McLeod.
Tanse, Daryl Lisiga so Wahia Utsinia, Amisquachi Waskahiga Notsinia, Doris Bertha Negawi, Sunny Clifford Notui. I always start with an introduction of myself in my own language, which is Nehial or Cree from northern Alberta. So I'm going to read to you from my novel, of course, A Season in Chesgun. And the protagonist in this novel is a young man, James, who was working in Vancouver teaching fairly well-to-do kids French immersion. And during his period as a French immersion teacher, his mother passed away, and he felt this disconnection with his culture and his people and was longing to reestablish it. So he applied for jobs in First Nations communities all over the country, and lo and behold, got a job as a school principal in a community in northern British Columbia, a fictitious community named Chesgun. So I was really inspired, Jennifer, and what an act to follow. What a great reading, Jen. Thank you so much.
You're just saying that because we're friends.
No, it's true. Jen is a mentor of mine as well as a good friend. But I was inspired by you reading the epigram of your book, and so I'm going to do the same. I came upon it late in the day writing the book, but it's really apropos, particularly for tonight's reading. If anyone asks you, how the perfect satisfaction of all of our sexual wanting will look. Lift your face and say, like this. So in this section of the book, James is settled in as the principal, and he's rolling out his curriculum, and part of that curriculum is, well, you'll see. So some of the characters you need to know about are Bella, the adult education teacher, Mr. Wallace, or Harry, a high school teacher, Ruthie, a new friend of James's, who's also a nurse and a counselor. Damon and Ali are named, and they're teachers in a school across the lake. And Louise is James's boss. Franyo is mentioned, and he's James's partner. And the residential school, LeJac, is mentioned. LeJac. So here we go. You take the condom out of the package like this. Tear one end open carefully, and then make sure you're holding it the right way. If all the lights are off, you'll have to figure this out by touch. When you hold it correctly and place the nipple-like top over the head of the penis, it rolls on easily like this. As James explained this technique to the wide-eyed teenagers, he placed a condom atop a banana and unfurled it. The teenagers burst into laughter. Could never see bananas the same way, one boy called out. I sure won't be eating them no more, a girl replied, laughing. James had hired Ruthie to collaborate with him in presenting a family life session to the teen group using the methods he learned in workshops given by the Vancouver School Board. Ruthie had a bachelor's degree in nursing and was working on her master's in counseling, but more importantly, she was kind and sensitive, motherly. James handed her a box of condoms to pass down each row of students. The boys clamored to grab as many as they could and stuff them into the pockets of their jeans or their desks. Only one girl took any. They're for my older brother, she groaned, scowling at accusing faces. Bella stood at the back of the room, taking in every word. Beside her, Mr. Wallace, Harry, the classroom teacher, sat rigid, a quizzical expression on his reddening face. James knew that Harry had gone to Catholic school, and it was like the first time he had sat through a session that was so open and direct about sex, and not using euphemisms or the common vulgar terms. Harry looked apoplectic when Ruthie began to explain to the teens how conception happens. There's only one way to get pregnant, Ruthie said to open. The guy's sperm encounters the gal's egg, but sperm are tricky little guys. They can survive in a woman's uterus for up to 5 days and impregnate her long after the thrill is gone. So guess what? A girl or woman can't go thinking that just because she's not ovulating at the time of sex that she won't get pregnant. Ruthie paused for a moment to let the information sink in. The room was so quiet, you could have heard conception happening. Also, she continued, if the gal performs oral sex on her guy, which is properly called fellatio, geez, sounds like an Italian word, even if the guy doesn't fully come in her mouth, which we properly call ejaculation, he may still release a few spermatozoids in what is called pre-cum. Then if they kiss and he decides to reciprocate, he may inadvertently plant his seed. Harry held his head in his hands, ears crimson red. Bella had a wide grin across her face. After school, James, Ruthie, and Bella made their way over a thick bed of brown, yellow, orange, and red leaves to the new portable classroom that housed the adult education program to make a similar presentation to the parents of the teens and to any other communities who were curious. It hadn't occurred to James that there was a need until Patrick, the custodian and one of the parents, asked him, "We don't want them to know more about the birds and the bees than us," he had said with a chuckle a few days ago. "Them priests and sisters didn't teach us nothing about that stuff, sex and production in LeJac." Halfway through the adult session, one of the women said pensively, "Nobody's ever given us this information before. It's so helpful. We figure it all out ourselves, and sometimes it caused big problems." Oh, so you can't get AIDS from a light kiss with a woman's or a handshake with a gay? One of the men asked partway into the presentation, looking solemn and fixing James's gaze. That is correct. Research is ongoing in terms of what exactly leads to the spread of HIV, but they know that, like for most other STDs, it cannot be transmitted simply. There must be an exchange of body fluids. A deep French kiss could possibly be dangerous if one of the participants is infected, Ruthie said in a calming tone. I was amazed to learn about the different trimesters of the baby growing in the womb and why it's so important not to drink liquor or do drugs when you're preggers. After the session, which went way longer than they had anticipated, James strolled back to the school with Ruthie, tired but content. The genuine gratitude of the parents was heartwarming. James felt the warm glow fading as he sat down in his office to go over budget numbers again. Money was missing out of the salaries line, and the amount was going up incrementally every month. He was heading for a deficit, and this would reflect badly on his competence as a new principal, the youngest principal in the province. He had just laid out the accounting worksheets on his desk when the satellite phone rang. What the fuck, James? It was Mike, the superintendent of schools, calling. You did a condom demo in your sex ed course this afternoon with a banana? You know there are staunch Catholics in that community, including elders, just as there are Baptists and Pentecostals here in Vanderhoof, some even school trustees. We discussed this, and I told you, the policy is that you can show the condom in its package, but you can't open it. You're not in radical Vancouver now. For Christ's sakes, James, what next? A live sex demo? This will get to the board. You can count on it. Well, Mike, I apologize for the controversy. I did what I've been trained to do. And I ran it by several elders, including Monique, a local matriarch. They thought the idea of doing sex education with the teens was great. Despite his calm tone, James was in a panic. He had used the information and materials from the Vancouver School Board sex ed program. And yes, he'd consulted other teachers, Damien and Ali, about it. Damien insisting he be direct and blunt in his presentation. His passion about it had made James even more sure of his own position. Ali, on the other hand, had been more circumspect, suggesting that James talk things over with his boss, Louise, first, about just how explicit he should be. After all, unlike city kids, the students of Chesgun likely lived a pretty sheltered life, and some of the elders were pretty religious, still thoroughly indoctrinated by their experience in the residential schools run by the churches. He wished he had taken Ali's advice more to heart, despite his own preference for being as direct and open as possible. That had been fine in Vancouver, an approach more aligned with city dwellers who are exposed to sexuality and sexual diversity around them all the time on a daily basis. And it was the approach set out in the curriculum. But here, being explicit like that in Chesgun was to push the community quantum leaps beyond their comfort zone. In the next academic year, he would still do the session, but would be less graphic. Leave the damn condom in its package. No banana. He felt so off balance, he needed to call his partner in Vancouver, Franyo. Franyo would understand. He dialed up the satellite phone. 6 desolate rings, no answer. Well, he talked to Damien about the issue on the weekend. James stepped into his office that evening to find Margaret, the elder who had taught him how to slice fish for smoking, slouched over the table in the staff room, sobbing mutedly. What tragedy could have occurred now? Had someone ventured across the frozen lake prematurely with their skidoo to get to Binka only to break the surface and sink? Had someone been shot in a hunting accident? Did someone else disclose a scandalous secret they'd been holding in for years? Margaret, what happened? What's wrong? They say you're going to be fired, Principal. Wanted to warn you. So silly. Just because of a stupid French safe. Who ain't seen one of those before? Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Our third reader tonight is Elisa York.
Hello. Thank you for coming, everyone. Thank you for having me, VFA. Friends and family in the audience. Two gals that I went to Central Junior High with. Far Cry is set in Rivers Inlet up the BC coast, 1922. Anders Viken, or Anders Viken, as he thinks of himself, is a Norwegian-Canadian fisherman turned storekeeper. He's in his early 60s. He's basically telling the story of his life to his de facto niece, who is Kit, and she's 18. And her mother and father are now gone, so that they're about all the family that each other has. So he's telling the story of his life and, to some extent, her own. I'll read a little bit from just the opening, and then I'll go a little further on into his story. So you have to picture me as I'm a fair bit taller. I'm a man. I'm Norwegian Canadian. I won't do the accent because you know it will just become German. I can't do Norwegian at all. So this morning the bay is green. Already the water has begun to stink, the yard's wide streak of the shithouse drift, the waste of 100 incomers or more. In 2 days' time, the cannery will come clanking to life. There will be blood on the waves, the sky wild with smoke and reeking steam, the wheeling white bodies of gulls. Time to be getting on. Soon enough, some fisherman who has not heard the news will come thudding down the boardwalk and halt to read my handwritten sign. Death in the family. I have left the shutters closed at the store and here at the cottage too. It is not always so convenient, living next door to your place of work. I ought to light the stove, warm the old dog lying by its iron feet, dig out a decent shirt. I wonder, Kit, will you wear a dress? You would feel easier in your work clothes, and is that not what your father would wish? I would have had his body here, you know that. But you wanted him carried home along the headland path, Knox, Willie, and myself each gripping a corner of the oilskin, while you insisted on taking the fourth. It was good of Ida to help you wash and dress him. Your father was not a large man, and you have always been strong for your size, but that is no job for a girl to manage alone. Young woman, I suppose I should say. I forget, you are 18 years old. Burial, too, will be no easy task in this country where the mountains lift up out of the sea. Any open ground is cross-hatched, roots over rock. You know the trouble your mother had scraping up enough soil for her plants. You are right, though. The lookout is a fitting spot. Your father and I walked that trail often enough, clearing deadfall and replacing pipe when the water line broke. A fair view out to the inlet. And yes, he never would have found his rest at sea. You are angry with me for how it happened, I know. But Kit, he would have been in the same state or worse on his own. I will be careful today, on my honor. Only one drink, before we troop up the mountainside with Frank in his box. Just enough to steady the soul. Okay, we'll jump ahead a bit. So he's telling her the story of his life. So he's in his 40s, mid-40s here. And actually, I should tell you that Anders is a winter swimmer, what we now might call a wild swimmer. He swims all year round in the ocean. It's part of how he keeps himself okay. So he has been living in Vancouver and going out to fish at Steveston, but living with a lot of people isn't really working anymore. So he's taken himself off to Smith Inlet, where he's basically living in a shack on a cove. You know what winter is in these parts. There were days, weeks, when the wind raged up the inlet and I dragged my rowboat into the brush where the tide could not snatch it away. The rain became a second lashing sea, turning the branches into great green fins. On heavy nights, I crawled beneath the coot's overturned hull to sleep. Neville's dictionary stayed wrapped in its square of oilskin. By then I had a proper habit of muttering, remembering my English to myself. A man needs shelter. I had noticed the ruin of a sawmill near the inlet's mouth. On the first clear day, I rowed back to scavenge boards. Salmonberry and salal had grown in over the place. I tied up to a tilting remnant of dock and hacked a path in. It was worth it. Some decent planks to be found among the rot. A zinc wash tub caught my eye, but when I took it up by the handles, I found the bottom had rusted through. A man in company would have cast it aside. I held it up like a picture frame and looked out through the crusted circle to see. They are lonely, those places where men have lived and left their wreckage behind. I had spent a month or more on the inlet with ravens for company, watching the tall fins of the blackfish as they passed the cove. Coming back from that old sawmill marked the first time I drank over my daily share. That night I held a parley with myself, ask and answer by the spitting fire. Well, Anders, you have come to this place. I have. And will you stay? I will. Alone? A pause while the questioned man drinks. How else? The light was gray when I woke with a jay calling shuka shuka overhead. Morning? Midday? My head lay on a sopping sponge of moss, red roots snaking round. A man could die, letting himself lie through a winter's night in wet clothes. I got myself upright, leaned on the shaggy bulk of a cedar until the sparks cleared from my eyes. It was not far to my camp. A thinking man would have dug out the less wet wood and started a fire to get warm. Instead, I stumbled down to the beach. The tide was falling. The cove iron-colored with a swaying swell, a fair chop on the inlet. I dropped the weight of my coat on the stones, worked out of my boots and trousers, dragged the wet sweater over my head. Fumbling at the buttons of my long underwear, I peeled the mess of it away. The wind cut into me as I walked into the surf. I dove as soon as I had the depth. Soon I could feel my heart, the circling beat of my blood. Out past the headland, I met the inlet's sweep, out to sea, out to sea. I stroked along, slipping inside its pull. Swimming is not walking, Kit. To stop is to begin to let go. What was there to lose? The cove? the camp, but the body would have its way. Warm now with trying, it turned into the current and came clawing back. Thank you.
Three wonderful readings, thank you. We're going to pause now, and when we come back, we will have a conversation about these three fantastic books, so please don't go far.
First time being part of this festival, and it's really nice to be in Victoria. And actually, I visited the bookstore nearby too, and that was a really beautiful bookstore. So I feel fortunate to be here, and thank you all for being here as well. I'm just going to read the first 6 pages of my novel. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. So this is at the border of Western Tibet and Nepal, spring 1960. Amma was an oracle. The realization came to my mother late in life, when her monthly bleeding stopped and something else opened inside. Some in our village called it an affliction. They said there was a crack in her mind, which left her open to spirits who would consume her. But Amma insisted it was a blessing to be able to lend her body to the gods and let them speak through her. In time, everyone would listen, and the words of an otherwise ordinary woman would lead us through the coming troubles. It wasn't just my mother who had changed. Packs of wolves and rats swept through our valley. Next, there was an earthquake that tore a jagged line through our village monastery. Then, just as I was learning to speak, there came news that invaders had crossed our eastern border, entering our land as 2 enormous snakes. In the distant town of Kardze, people watched them cross the river in long lines and burrow into the highlands. They wished to be called the People's Liberation Army, but we knew them as the Kyami, a people from the lowlands to the east. In the years that followed, rumors came like crows, even traveling as far west as our village. Although I was just a young girl, many of the rumors landed at my ears before anyone else in my family. My source was Laksam, my oldest friend. He worked as a servant to a traveling merchant who traded in gossip as much as iron pots and pans. In our free moments, Laksam and I wandered in the pastures with my little sister Tenki, hanging on my back or flopping around in the grass. In those hills, Laksam told me the most shocking stories. Kyami soldiers had seized farmland in the east, and most of our people were now starving. No grain, no salt, no meat, or even butter. I walked around in a daze after hearing this, unable to imagine life without butter. Laksam said that although it was quiet in our region, a resistance raged in the east, in places where iron birds circled the skies and bullets, big and small, rained down on entire towns, smashing bodies as if they were nothing but effigies made of dough. Where rooftops were torn apart and no one could tell whether they had found the remains of a loved one or that of a stranger. But I did not tell my family these things. I never repeated them to anyone. Then, last spring, our village heard of a terrifying ruse, a plan to lead the precious one into the dragon's home. Hearing about this trap, thousands of our people gathered in Lhasa, outside the summer palace, forming a protective circle with their bodies. Even as the soldiers neared and the scent of gunpowder swirled in the air, our people refused to leave. To prevent a massacre, the precious one disguised himself as a commoner and fled south by night to another country. So did the great Nechung oracle, who had divined their escape route through the mountains. When the foreign troops learned that our leader had slipped away, they pierced the crowd with bullets and lined the street with corpses. After the precious one left, the sun was erased from our skies. Flowers refused to bloom, and our yaks made no milk. In that darkness, every family in our village wondered if it was time to leave, to follow our leader to the lowlands until the day when it would be safe to return. Others recited a bleak ancient prophecy. When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, the people of snows will be scattered like ants across the face of the earth. It was that day, nearly 10 years after revealing that the gods had spoken to her, when Amma said to us, "Now is the time. I must give my body to the spirits." Sitting on the kitchen floor beside my sister, I watched my father's face in the hearth's glow. Bala remained still as we chewed on strips of dried meat that Amma had cured over the winter. I could see that our father was clearly picturing everything that would change for us. But after a long while, he frowned, showing all his new wrinkles at once, and nodded in agreement. By morning, our entire village had heard that Amma would begin the rites for instructing the gods. She would finally call them down to her. It made sense when they said Tenki was too young to watch the initiation. She was barely 10. But I couldn't believe it when Pala also ushered me out of the room. While at least 20 people from our village filed into the kitchen, many of them patting Tenki and me on our cheeks and heads as if to cheer us up, the two of us were forced to wait in the hallway. Even Laksam managed to slip in, though not without flashing a huge grin in my direction. I stood there chewing my nails until the prayers began. Then I realized what I needed to do. Taking Tenki outside, I ordered my sister to gather our sheep along the hills and bring them all back, a task that would take at least an hour, even with our dog Dixon's help. Thankfully, my sister was somewhat obedient this time. She went off to search for the sheep, and I rushed back home to watch the ceremony through a slit in the wooden door. Over a thick huddle of bodies, I saw Amma seated on the ground with her head down. Beside her stood a teacher monk and his young assistant, who looked frightened to perform a task like this when he typically spent his days carrying milk and water up to the monastery. "If you are a god," said the elderly monk as he faced my mother, "take this apron." The assistant produced an apron and tied it around my mother's waist. Amma continued to gaze at the floor as her body trembled. "If you are a god, then take this drum and bell." The assistant placed these instruments in Amma's hands. "Come to this woman, speak to us. Stay not at the mountaintop, but come to us." Amma began to shake and whisper in a bird-like voice. The assistant placed a heavy embroidered cape around her shoulders, then a 5-pointed crown on her head. Despite the weight of the regalia, Amma hopped up on her feet and began to rock side to side. The assistant moved away, his eyes wide with fear, but the teacher monk called him back. "Take this golden drink," he said, holding out a bowl of beer. Putting down her instruments, my mother took the bowl, offered it to the sky, and drank the beer in one gulp like a man. Then she danced, spinning to the left and right, dipping and jerking her head. The teacher monk leaned in, pushed my mother's shoulders down to keep her still, and spoke into her ear. She shook like a startled horse and uttered a language I could not understand. Was this the language of the gods? Hearing my mother's words, the teacher monk nodded and reached into a bowl of rice. With a graceful flick, he tossed a handful of grains onto the drum held flat in his hand. It sounded like a rain shower and still echoes in my head. "It is dangerous to call the gods," he told the audience. "We must ensure that we have not called a malicious spirit by mistake." The teacher monk explained that if an evil spirit entered her body, there would be chaos for Amma and everyone who sought her help. On the other hand, if part of my mother's consciousness remained in her body when the spirit entered, She would become half God and half human, and then we could not trust her words. Hearing this, I began to shake. If the gods never left my mother's body, she would never be herself again. Why would Pala agree to this? Yet it was already far too late to stop. The teacher said that it was time for the test. Amma must be able to say, without looking, exactly how many grains of rice had landed on the drum. She also needed to know the meaning of this number, what it prophesied. Pressing my face into the door, I strained to learn the outcome. I had my answer when the elderly monk slowly knelt and prostrated himself before my mother. A wave of prayers rose from the crowd as they too lowered to the floor. Only I remained standing, peering through the crack, trying in vain to catch a glimpse of my mother's face. Then my chest felt heavy like wet clay, and I was drawn face down to the floor, my palms pressed above my head, my lips moving rapidly in prayer as breath spread between my ribs. Word traveled across the western plains. Visitors came to see my mother, a little wary and curious, bowing and speaking in hushed tones like they did at the monastery. Even my father's old friend Chosang arrived at our door with his ailing son between his legs. Everything has changed, Bala said, but to me she's still just my Yangchen. Yes, that must also be true, Chosang replied, tidying his worn sleeves as he settled in and waited for his son's turn with Amma. In the days that followed, Bala fetched 2 servants to help with the visitors. Tenki and I watched them float around the house with tea and food and ceremonial objects for divinations, while parched, weary horses milled about the courtyard and waited for their masters to be healed. How many hundreds came in that strange time, in the year before we fled the highlands? How many came knocking on our wooden door, sweeping in the dust with their foreign robes, leaving their scent long into the evening? Even now, so far from home, I can close my eyes and remember this peculiar silk brocade designs on the sleeves and collars. I can picture the red gown worn by a distant warlord's wife, that thin, white-haired woman who had asked if her child's marriage was well fated. She said her own marriage had been an unhappy one, and whatever answer Amma gave, the woman returned again to ask if she should make a pilgrimage to Lhasa despite ill health and invading forces. Just as Tenki and I had grown used to her visits, a summer and a fall passed without any sight of her. There came rumors that she had fallen down a well or was called to its bottom by an evil spirit. Now it seems more likely that the Gyami had imprisoned her. Then there were the visitors who came to ask about the health of their herds and whether they should search at home or in the hills for a lost turquoise. Some came with ailments like melancholy and restlessness. They said only Amma could name the source of their sorrows. Only she could banish the evil from their bodies. Yes, that is what they said. It wasn't long after Amma's initiation that the snake entered our village. A row of dark trucks, rattling the earth and sending up clouds of dust. Still, the foreigners didn't seem as frightening as I had imagined. I had almost expected to see horns sticking out of their heads. But they were just young men and women who insisted that they had come not to hurt us. All they wanted to do was gather everyone and have a conversation. We were required to do as they said, so Tenki and I walked to the village square as Dixon followed closely by. The crowd was thick, but we slipped in to the first row. "We have heard about the oracles in your region," said the head soldier, his country's words translated by a former salt merchant who was now working for the invaders. "It's time to get to the bottom of these rumors," the merchant translated, though his Lhasa dialect was hard for us to understand. As the head soldier gave his orders, I noticed how handsome he was, even as he moved his head in a jerking manner. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old. 2 soldiers led 3 women into the circle. Amma was in the group. Right away, I pulled Tenki close so she wouldn't cry out. We watched as the women headed to the center of the square and were instructed to stand in a line. Amma kept her gaze down toward the hills. Amma kept her gaze toward the hills while the other woman looked into the crowd as though silently requesting help. People murmured and shifted in agitation. Even Dixon began to growl beneath his shaggy bangs, so I nudged him twice with my knee to quiet him. "If the power of these so-called oracles are real," The merchant said, "If these superstitions have any basis, these women will surely pass a simple test." A soldier carried a large bowl of water into the middle of the crowd. He walked around the circle, showing the contents of the bowl. Inside, there were several stones within the water. All but one of the stones were ordinary. That one stone was bright red coral. "Red as the star on my head," the soldier said, pointing at his head with a smile. A few people smiled and laughed nervously in return. The soldiers went to the first woman in line and tied a blindfold around her eyes. I told myself there was nothing to fear. This test was not unlike the ones Amma faced during her initiation. She would surely find the coral among the pebbles. Thank you.
Is this now you can hear me? Okay, welcome back, everyone. I have 25 pages of questions, but I promise you, I promise you, it's only because the books are so interesting. Well, there might be, but it'll be multiple choice. So I think there's a good chance we'll pass. Thank you all for your readings. That was fantastic. I think given the theme of this evening, the place to start is for me to ask you to tell us a bit more about why you've chosen your particular setting. So where are your novels set, and why did these places speak to you?
Well, I think it boils down to me. The community is fictitious, but the area of the province is not. The area of British Columbia is not fictitious. Northern British Columbia. This community, Chasegun, is situated somewhere northwest of Prince George. And, I have traveled up there a number of times, many times, and spent time up there. And it's one of the most spectacular places I've ever visited in the world. And one of the magnificent things about it is that you can go onto a lake there on a canoe or on any kind of boat and spend the day or a couple of days paddling or even with a motorboat, and you won't come across another soul. You might come across an island, you can stop on the island and spend time there, you won't meet anybody else, and nobody else will come across you. And it's so beautiful. I mean, geographically, the vista of the lakes, the mountains, the sky, the wildlife is just spectacular. So I wanted to share that part of the world with the rest of the world, and not just other Canadians, but with the world, because it's absolutely magnificent.
I would say that one of the biggest reasons in hindsight, not in the beginning, often when I do a reading, I share the dedication. And so my biggest reason for setting it where I set it and what it meant to me was that I dedicated this book to my 2 grandchildren who are from the Cayucit First Nation, which, even though Tawakan is fictional, it's, to me, obviously Cayucit, which is on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island. And I said, you know, to my grandchildren, Arthur and Ripley, may you be treated by the world with grace and respect. May you always be told stories that make you believe in yourself and in all the possibilities and choices you have in this world. And may you be given the very best teachers with the very best hearts in the very best schools with the very best resources, because making things good for Indigenous children is good for all of Canada. And so for me, I saw so many shortcomings as a teacher in these remote communities that they're not given the very best teachers with the very best hearts, with the very best resources. And so for me, that's why I said it. That was the whole purpose of the book.
I think for me, every book that I've written sort of starts with something mysterious. So with this one, it was just a sense of a cannery. And I don't think I've even been inside one, but I just had this sense of that place. And so what happens when that kind of thing happens is that I start to read. And I just started reading about canneries. And I came across a book called The Good Hope Cannery, which is about a real cannery set that was on Rivers Inlet. And I just loved that. You know, it's just a little book by a small local publisher about a local place, and the novel started to go poof, 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 poof. And so then, you know, I wanted it to be called something with a kind of resonance like Good Hope, but darker. So Far Cry. It's, you know, I just tried things out until it became the fictitious place that it was. But then I think also before that, it's, you know, that comes from so many directions. And before that, as you mentioned in the intro, I spent a lot of time in the boat with my dad and my brother. And I think then you get that in your body, right? A lot of that stuff. And I've cleaned a fair few salmon. Never done any gill netting, but, you know, caught some salmon. Yeah.
What was it like writing about Rivers Inlet when you're not at Rivers Inlet?
Well, by this point in my long and storied career, I've written books set in the Amazon before I ever went to the Amazon, and Utah before I ever went to Utah. And so that's kind of how I write. So by this point, I just, you know, I mean, I actually had a lot more knowledge because I grew up on the West Coast. So it's not exactly the same biome per se in Victoria as it might be in Rivers Inlet, but you have that sense of kelp and orca and rocks and waves and cedar and on, right? You have that in your body too. So in many ways, it was easier than some of those other books that way. Yeah, it was great.
So the communities in your work are sometimes based on real places, and sometimes are real places and are sometimes fictionalized versions of places. You don't have to worry about the real life readers in the fictional places, but do you think about real readers in the real places in the areas that you write about? You know, here we are in Victoria, but yeah, do you wonder about what the local reaction might be like?
Well, I would say that I'm not worried about what Victoria readers think. If you've already bought the book, because then you've already spent the money. But I've always been concerned what Cayucit readers think, because I tried hard to not make them be resembling people there. I don't think I've always succeeded. And I remember once reading an interview with Joyce Carol Oates, and she said, whenever I've written about a small town that I've lived in, I think it was the Mulvaneys she was actually referring to, but she said, everyone thought that the person they weren't were them, and vice versa, basically. And that's what I've experienced. But I've always been very concerned because I don't want to feel like I'll be honest, I don't want to feel like I've betrayed those people that I'm close to, especially being a non-Indigenous writer writing about them. And fortunately, they've been huge supporters of the book, both books. And they're the ones who are more than non-Indigenous people, the people who go, thank you for telling the truths of what you see from your perspective, with, in a heartfelt way. So that's always been my concern, is how very local people perceive the book.
Thanks, Jen. Well, in my case, the community of Chesgun is a conflation of a number of communities I've been to and known about and read about and imagined, as are most of the characters' conflations of people that I've known and met or imagined. And, what I'm hoping happens is that the amazing love that the protagonist felt for the community members, I'm hoping it really shines through. And if any communities, Indigenous communities in British Columbia or anywhere in the Americas, kind of relates and identifies with Chesgun, I hope they feel that love that that protagonist felt for the people he was working with. And one of the magical things was, it's funny as you work through the editing process, because you have to reread. I had to reread my own novel to know where it ended up, because the editing process can be long and complicated. And it wasn't overly long or overly complicated, but still things shift and change as you're editing. And I just wanted so much for the people for James, the protagonist, to be able to communicate to the people in the community about how incredibly precious their lands are, their land, their territory, the resources, and how marvelous their connection is, and how remarkable it is that they have this phenomenal connection with the land. And it's perhaps something that somebody who lives in a community and has lived in the community all their lives, and who's maybe 4th, 5th, 10th, 200th generation, doesn't realize that they have this phenomenal connection. And so I'm hoping that people in communities like Chesgun, wherever they be, sort of extrapolate that and adopt that for themselves.
I don't think that I feel concerned. I mean, first of all, it's 1922, so everybody's gone, and they were all made up. But I guess for me, it takes the form of needing to make it as real and alive and true as I can, and then I feel like I've done my job. That's all I got to say on that one.
That makes sense. Daryl, I want to pick up on something you were saying about the connection to place, because at the start of the book, James seems to have everything going well for him. I mean, living in Vancouver and going for a walk to Kitts Beach, and but he's got a real sense of disconnection. It seems to me. Is that what you were trying to get at the beginning of the book? This sense of not being immersed in the place that you live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so many urban Indigenous people feel and live that sense of disconnection. I personally, in my book, Piagal, my second memoir, open it by saying that I felt I was in exile from my own lands, because where I'm from is very close to the Athabasca tar sands. And what was once pristine, beautiful nature with creeks and rivers and streams and amazing wildlife populations is now covered with pipelines and compressor stations and stuff like that. So in this book, I really wanted to bring out just how much people have become displaced and forced into situations. All of those people, you know, the stereotypical people you see, unfortunately, stereotypical people, Indigenous people that we see down and out on the streets of Vancouver, Victoria, Calgary, Edmonton, wherever, are probably living in exile and have been forced away from the land with which they feel that amazing, rich connection. And as a result, in many cases, are lost and will have a very hard time getting back to it. In my particular case, I was very fortunate to have to build a tremendous life for myself. That was just wonderful. And James in the book, and James is not Daryl, but James as well managed to build an amazing life for himself. But when he lost his mother and he was living thousands of kilometers away from his own land, felt this tremendous sense of disconnection and had to do something to find it, to regain it.
So James is a teacher,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of teaching in the novel, and I think everyone here either is or has worked as a teacher. So I'm very curious about how your own experiences outside the writing as teachers have shaped what is going on in the stories you're telling.
Okay, me. Oh, wait. It's not on. Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, I mean, this is probably my most autobiographical work I'll ever do. I mean, this is, in terms of my consternations about how to reach kids that I had a very different upbringing from, this is very much my experience. And I don't think that I used to go to Pro D things, as teachers do, and I would meet with teachers from Surrey and Victoria and various places, and we just had completely different experiences. And even when I would say, I don't have these resources, I don't have these accesses, I can't access certain resources for my students, they would all say, well, we're all in the same boat, because it was a bemoaning of government resources. Like, you're not in the same boat, because compounded to that is we actually don't have these resources, and my psychological isolation as a human being in a place where I'm an outsider does not compare to you in an urban or suburban setting. And so it really made me realize that these, unless you go to a remote community, like a really remote community, like when my first experience was teaching up in Dease Lake, which is a very remote. And I used to have people from Prince George say, I know what you mean. That's not the same, because you're in an urban center. Dease Lake is 7 hours north of Smithers and 7 hours south of Whitehorse. Like, it's a difficult place to be. And so I don't think, for me, it's just, it really made me realize how people don't, and I didn't until I went to them, you don't understand what those places are like.
For me, I teach creative writing, so there's just a continual, you see the same things. I mean, people are working on such different things, and they're at different levels, and they're struggling with different things all the time, but you see the same things coming back. And more I just understand how much is answered through process, right? That how much we want to be able to figure everything out with our daily brain, and how much we can't figure things out with our daily brain when we're writing, you know, and that's why we write, because that as we write, the process is, you know, we're continually coming up against things and figuring them out through doing. And then that kind of, it seems to feed my writing, and the writing feeds the teaching, and then those lessons kind of help with the rest of life too. sometimes.
Well, as an educator, even in Vancouver, there was always a scarcity of resources. And I mean, as a young teacher, I funded all kinds of things out of my own pocket, which I'm sure teachers are still doing. Elementary, primary, elementary, and high school teachers spend a lot of their own money on little projects they want their students to do, and so on. And as I moved through, I was a teacher and then a school principal, and then in my personal life, and then worked in the post-secondary system, and ended up working in government, doing policy in post-secondary education. There's always a shortage of resources, and there always is going to be a shortage of resources in that field because it doesn't get the priority that it should get in terms of funding and policy decisions and that sort of thing. But what I'm amazed at through my career is the ingenuity of educators in being able to adapt. And that's what I tried to show in as a season in Chisgun, was that creative thinkers will find ways of adapting and making the best of situations and of working with. It's not to justify or to condone or to invite, government underfunding and chronic underfunding, but educators are usually called to their profession and usually are dedicated to it and find ways of being creative. And the human spirit is amazing. When they make that connection with the population they're serving, amazing things can happen.
And I think in your book, one of the things that really comes through clearly is the difference between educators who have the vocation that you're talking about and the bureaucrats who are always putting up obstacles of various kinds. Jen, I want to pick up on this idea of remote communities. They're remote from the point of view of people who aren't there, but for the people who live there, that's their home. And I'm wondering what you find so interesting as a writer about these places that outsiders don't see or don't see much of.
Well, I think that, first of all, you kind of just said it, is we assume, when I was teaching in Cayucit, certain family members said, sort of, when are you going to come back? Which they meant like civilization. And there's this notion of the centeredness, like we're in the center. And I'm like, well, why am I not in the center, right? And so I think that's one thing that's always fascinated me. I'm going to cheat a little on your question just so I can address something Daryl said, which is, yes, there's a lack of resources, but that also includes like human resources. So for anyone who might be a teacher in the audience, in a remote community, we don't have TOCs, teachers on call. We have POCs, people on call. So that means that, for instance, when I taught in Dees Lake, my teaching assistant, who had no training whatsoever, was also well known as the local crack dealer. So that's a completely different educational environment that you're existing in. And so that answers partly why I'm so fascinated with it, because I'm like, how can this be? How can this be that in my classroom, this person, I know, everybody knows, deals crack, and they're helping my grade 7s at the time learn what made Canada or whatever. So to me, it's almost a bizarre scenario that is so foreign to what we experience here in Victoria, anywhere else.
Thanks. Elisa, I have a question.
I'm ready.
Okay. 1922. That's the question. Why 1922?
Yeah, I mean, so the process goes that there's an awful lot of following, and so I'm following. So I read about Good Hope, I read about certain times at Good Hope and what it's like there then. I start reading around that time. I start to have a sense, okay, maybe it's happening around this time. Is it before or after the Great War? I start to ask myself questions like that. Like, you start to think about really big currents that are moving through. And, then that's, every time you ask one of those questions, it starts to shape the narrative, right? And I always do a ton of research, and I love doing research, and there's this great symbiosis between the research and the imaginative process. So at a certain point, for quite a long time, it helps to have that stuff loose, and then it starts to be the time when I need to get out my graph paper and start. You can do this in computers too, but I like graph paper a lot for drawing maps. I draw maps and I draw timelines and I do all that sort of stuff, and I have it all up on the wall. And at some point I realize, okay, I need to know what year he's telling the story from, and I need to nail it down. And at this point I've realized, okay, I want some stuff to happen in the Great War, and I want to be a few years after that's over. And so those things start to just kind of fall into place, and then then you go back from there. Okay, how old is Anders then? And so then if we go to his childhood, what's happening then? And it's just this long series of question and answer, and at some point it becomes clear. But I think probably that first book that I read about Good Hope started me toward the time. But also novels just have a feel, right? Like the one I'm working on right now, it just feels like it's, early 70s, like early on. I was like, oh yeah, it's the 70s. I don't know why.
So you mentioned research. I'm going to ask a possibly dangerous question of our other panelists. What are your research processes like?
I have none. I go live and then I write. I was talking about this earlier, actually, I think somewhere. Anyways, in my own mind. But I had three people in the past, after heaviness of things that float. Two nurses and one doctor who had worked in remote communities, and they came to me and said, "You nailed it." And how much research did you do? And I said, none. And it's indicative of how we write fiction, that we only need that one single detail, potentially, that then fills the whole reader's mind from that one single detail. And I think in the case of heaviness, it was, I was at a community potluck in Cayucit, and a nurse I very much revered she was going to retire, and she said, and she also had built a house there, and she said, "I can't wait to come out and hang out with my friends without them looking at me like they know I know all their medical details." And that single moment in heaviness, because of course you've all read it, filled in. I think that's what filled in. That was a single detail that filled it in for people. And so I don't do research. It doesn't interest me. If I can't write a story without researching, I probably won't write it because I just don't want to research. I want to write. And so I think it only takes that one detail. What do you think, Daryl? How much do you research after doing everything you did in your life?
Well, I prefer to call it mining because I'm constantly at it. I'm in a lineup in a coffee shop, and it's 10 people deep, and I don't want to look at my damn cell phone, so I look at the people in the lineup, at their facial structure, at their appearance, how they're dressed, their hair, how they talk, and some of those features will end up in one of my books eventually, maybe not right away. So that's a type of research, just the daily kind of ongoing stuff. And Google, I'm ashamed to admit, is my constant companion. When I'm writing, if I have a question about like the piece I'm working on right now is kind of, it's not a memoir, it's going to be a genre-busting kind of book. It's called The Days After and the Days Before. And, but at one point in my life, I did go on a tour of Southeast Asia. And so there's going to be a personal essay about my experiences in Southeast Asia. So I wanted to know more about the King of Thailand. So I'm, Googling and finding more out about the king because I know it's a fascinating story. And I want to put it in there. And it's a modern theocracy, even though people aren't calling it that. And so, as I'm writing, I'll flip into Google for a few minutes. And then hopefully that'll take me to something deeper that's more reliable than Wikipedia. Yeah, it's constant. And on the one hand, I love it because I'm constantly learning as I'm writing. What I don't like about it is it really slows me down. And then it's always a challenge to know just how much information to incorporate so you don't put your readers to sleep. And how to incorporate it in an interesting way. It's a constant challenge. But I love the research, I really do. For my second memoir, Piagao, after I'd finished the draft that I'd sent to the publisher and it had been accepted and they had their editor on it, she called me one day and said, something's missing. You haven't set the stage adequately. And I knew exactly what she was talking about. I knew that there was a piece missing at the front end. And so I put down my writing tools and researched for 6 months. And with really rich results. But it took 6 months of research to write a chapter that is maybe the shortest chapter in the book.
So I think everyone is now duly warned that if you go have coffee in Souk, you might end up in the next book.
Victoria too.
Okay. I think it's about time that we turn things over to the audience, but I want to ask a question, one more question of each of you, which is this. Since we've been talking about books with remote BC settings, I'm wondering if you can think of a book that has been meaningful to you as you've been writing these books. Someone else's novel or a set of short stories or something set in BC that helped you as you were working on these projects.
I don't have one. I mean, there were many books that were set in BC. I don't think there's, there's stuff set in Chinatown, Vancouver, right? And of course, Wei-Sun Choi, wonderful memoir and novels. But the book that actually I think was the biggest deal was actually by a Norwegian called Morten Stroksnes, and it's called Shark Drunk, and it's just one of the best books ever. So, and it's not about the BC coast, but it's about, northern Norway and so many things that, fjords and islands and orcas and like all kinds of things that we have in common on the other side of the world,
Well, the book that inspired me most for A Season in Chisgun is not a BC book. It's set in Quebec. And it was Une saison dans la vie d'Emmanuel, A Season in the Life of Emmanuel by Marie-Claire Blais. And, I read that book in second year university as part of a Canadian Lit course. And it just stuck with me. I still have my original copy of it. I reread it probably every 2 years. It's in French. I read it in French, and I love that book so much. And I think what I loved about it was it depicted a Canadian reality that, for my era, the age I am, there was nothing that came close to depicting any Canadian reality close to mine as Une saison dans la vie d'Emmanuel did. And I love the structure of it, I love the characters, and so that truly inspired me. But when you're talking about a BC book, a BC-based book, book that's setting in BC, I have to say, and I'm not just sucking up, Jen, that that the heaviness of things that float, I thought, if I can create the experience, like Jen takes you in her first novel, takes you on this amazing trip through the West Coast that is just so scenic, so picturesque, so real, so vivid, that I just love that, and it inspired me, and I thought, if I can reproduce that, I'll be very grateful.
It's because I bought him dinner. No, but thank you, Daryl. You ruined my joke, because I was going to say Elisa's book and Daryl's book are what inspired me, but that chronologically doesn't make sense. I don't, like, for me, I think, well, one of my, in terms of Vancouver Island writers, Jack Hodgins is my go-to. Like, I think he is just, I think he's starting to be forgotten too, which is a shame. I think he's so magnificent in his...
I'm still talking about.
Oh, good. But I think, you know, aside from his portrayal of interesting characters on Vancouver Island, what I was trying to do, I didn't see a precedent, because I think that one thing that I encountered, of course, was that I'm not Indigenous. I'm writing about an Indigenous community. This is a time at which that's not allowed, and for good reason. And so there wasn't really a precedent for what I was trying to do, because publishers ended up saying, yeah, but she's saying this from the characters are non-Indigenous and how we feel when we go to these places as outsiders. And so I don't think I had good precedents. Maybe there were some, but they honestly weren't well done, because they were done at a different period of time in which the perception of being an outsider was actually that you weren't an outsider, you were the person there to save. And so I don't quite have the same experience, maybe. I don't.
Okay, thanks. So, at this point, I think we can take questions. I can see people in the first few rows and not much beyond that. So,
Bring up the lights a bit?
or people could just shout out their questions, and I'll try to repeat them if need be.
I have a question, and I don't know if the other two have written creative nonfiction, but Daryl, I'm familiar with your creative nonfiction, and now you're writing fiction. And as a friend in writing, I'm wanting to know if the process experience, like the contrast between writing creative nonfiction and outright fiction, whether as a creative process it was a different experience. Whether, I know what it is, whether the discipline of writing creative nonfiction differs from the discipline of writing fiction.
Yeah, I mentioned the word mining earlier, and in my memoirs, what I had to become very skilled at was mining my own memories, my own memory banks, my journals, notes that I'd had. And to do that, I would use devices like music was a big one. So if I was writing about the 60s, I'd Google the 60s hit parade and put on the 60s hit parade. And music is amazing at what it conjures. And so the memories and thoughts and the richness. The other thing is, you know, other sensual things like food, ice cream, things like that. And I learned this from a friend of mine who is a mentor, still, Betsy Warland, about conjuring and mining your own memories. And it's really rich. One really tricky and kind of subconscious exercise that she gave us one time was to take an item, a physical item from your past, from an important time in your past, and put it under your pillow or near your bed at night and see what happens. And I tell you, I did that with this vest that I had, from a buckskin vest from when I was working in northern BC. And the next morning I woke up and I couldn't get to the computer fast enough. And I wrote for 2 hours. It was just magical. But fiction, on the other hand, you know, I came from this group of mentors whose belief is that, I mean, I did have one mentor when I was in the Banff Writers Studio who thought you needed to map out the plot before you could start writing. And he said to me that he couldn't start writing his book before he knew how the story ended, how the plot concluded. But my other mentors have had this approach where you trust the narrative. And Betsy Warland and Shayna Lambert would say, trust the narrative, it knows where it needs to take you, and it'll guide you. And people also used to say, fiction writers would say, your characters will take on a life of their own, and they'll tell you how they want to be and what they want to do. And I just kind of scoffed that. I was skeptical about it. But when I started writing A Season in Shay's Gun, that was very true. My characters came to life in my mind very much. I would dream about them. I would be obsessed with one for, weeks on end. And they made sure that they got in there the way they needed to be portrayed. It's fascinating.
Hi, by way of perspective, I'm Elisa's dad. She was... I'm a plant over here.
How did you get to be so brilliant?
It's hereditary.
And that's why she's in the will. But anyway, you may know this, you may not. Elisa was born in Athabasca and grew up in the bush with me, winter camping, hanging off the front of my freighter canoe. So the wilderness is very much in her, and as she's mentioned, countless hours of fishing with me. And I've also been to Dease Lake twice. So I want to come up into this century and further into this century with a question for each of you. I am aware of what's going on with the Writers Guild in the United States and one of the major sticking points. I'm wondering if any of you have comments about a threat or non-threat from evolving artificial intelligence, AI, that will go into the memory bank of your creativity and literally thieve it.
Well, Dad. I mean, it's weird. My whole life long with writing, I feel as though, I have to create this space within which I can be receptive to whatever it is. And there are all these other factors in life that are often not supportive of that, right? So now I've been doing it long enough that that's my practice. I kind of go, well, I will go to my desk and, read about this for 5 years. And so it feels to me like, on the one hand, I understand that these are huge, in many ways, scary, shifting things that are happening in the universe and in our world. And I do wonder, this whole idea of, let's mine everybody's novels so we can figure out what people sound like. And I just think, we know what people sound like. We're doing it already. Like, I do wonder about that innovating ourselves to smithereens kind of thing that we're doing, right? Like fracturing everything and breaking it up into code. And I worry about it. And then at the same time, in relation to my writing, I just think, well, I've always been over here doing this thing that really only makes sense when you're inside it, or when you meet a reader who's been inside it. So I just keep doing that because now that's become how I've made a life. And there's just, I don't know how many shades of madness swirling around, and this is another one. That's actually true. What's true for me? Yeah, I worry about it, and then I also think, better go work on the book.
I actually don't worry about it at all. I think that as a teacher, to talk about where I've come from, a remote school setting, I now teach at Shawnigan Lake School, which is the biggest private boarding school in Canada. So that's a stark difference. And I've already caught kids who use AI for essays. And it's so obvious, and yes, it will improve, but right now it's so obviously different. There's a cadence, a syntax you can recognize, and to me it's ultimately so subtly unhuman that every piece of art and every piece of writing that AI generates will, to me, always be so almost nuancedly unhuman that we'll all feel it and we'll feel its soullessness.
Well, I take great comfort from that, Jen, but also I think that technology, will police itself eventually, so that just as there's software now to detect plagiarism, I'm sure there'll be technology apps, etc., that can detect whether a piece is generated from artificial intelligence, chat GPT or whatever it is, or something else, or whether it's come about more organically from a human mind. I think that will come about eventually. But when I transpose it, I mean, as a writer, of course, there are innate fears about that. But when I transpose it to other media like visual arts and music, I have less fear. Because in visual arts, for example, there's been technology, I think it was the knockoffs of great masters in visual arts in China, where somebody had set up this elaborate paint by number process where works of the great masters were being imitated, and it was almost impossible to tell if they were fake or real. But where has that gone? And so this is similar, except it's using advanced technology. But I think it'll find its place, and hopefully it finds its place as a tool for artists like us that we can potentially exploit and use to our advantage in the future. We'll see.
Yeah, I always think, apparently humans have not yet figured out how to synthesize the flavor of honey. Like, we just can't do it. And so I always comfort myself with that thought. Only the bees can make the honey.
We're a bunch of bees.
We're bees.
Anyone else? Burning question?
I think it's a question for me. With the landscapes, I have only read one of the three of your books, but the question for all of you, I've read Elisa's book, and Elisa's story in that book is hard to read and hold what happens. But I found comfort in the richness of the landscape, and I could handle it better, and I'm just wondering if there's a similar relationship between in all of your characters and your landscapes that help hear hard stories. Like at the beginning of yours, I'm terrible, and I'm going to forget your name. Oh my God, there you are. No, well, not Daryl, but Jennifer, thank you. The fear of the forest in the beginning. Like, I haven't read your book yet. I guess I'm gonna have to read it. Or I want to read it. But just give me a preview of how does the landscape help hard story, if there's hard stories in there, which there are.
Well, I think in her case, as an outsider, the landscape makes it all the more harder because she's in a situation where she comes to acknowledge that there are unseen things that the local people understand are there, but as someone who's not from that area, she doesn't fully understand and doesn't entirely buy that they are there. Like, there's a big issue with Sasquatch and how they truly believe how Sasquatch operate in their territory. In terms of her fear of the forest, that's actually one of the most autobiographical parts of the book, because it actually, I never name him, but it's the Beast of BC, which if you grew up in, I'm 52, if you grew up anywhere close to my age in BC, you know that that was Clifford Robert Olson. And I had a boy from my community in Surrey, Simon Partington, was one of his victims. And so that really impacted me. And so that actually personally played into my fear of the forest. And so I put that into that character. So there's really for her, there's no comfort in, she comes to terms with the forest, but she doesn't see that same, in the way you explained about Elisa's book, that there was comfort in the landscape to carry you through the narrative.
Yeah, I think for me as a writer, and I'm glad to hear for you as a reader, that's a big part of making it through those kinds of narratives. There's the natural world, which is, can be dangerous and terrifying, and also just the greatest comfort. Like, I think there's a scene in Far Cry, it just came to mind, where Kit's in the boat with her father, Frank, and they're just in a cove with a couple of humpbacks, and she just, at one point he says, "Have a listen," and she puts her ear to the boards and can hear the sound of the humpbacks speaking to one another through the, and to me, like, no matter what awful things happen to Kit, that's going to help her for the rest of her life, that she's experienced that, right?
Well, it's okay. I feel the power coming to me, but it's not working. Well, I think what, in the case of Season and Shizgun, I think every character, it's interesting, I hadn't done this analysis. I mean, I don't know how much the two of you analyze and reanalyze your books when you've got a solid first draft, but I hadn't done the analysis of the connection of each character with the land. But I think there is a powerful connection with the land for each of the Indigenous characters, for sure. But there's this huge awareness of the danger and the power of nature as well. Like, the extreme cold is a constant threat. Water, is a constant threat. For, very few people actually know how to swim or have taken water safety. So, and there's wildlife, which is a constant threat. So there's sort of this yin and yang thing, I guess, in my book, of the beauty, comfort, and solace that nature can provide, but also this incredible awareness of the danger that it can take your life in a minute.
Well, and nature's getting strange now too, right? With all of the unusual or extreme forest fires and other signs of climate change. I mean, nature is not what we thought it was. Okay, we have time for one more question, if there is one. Speak now or forever.
I think there's one hand in the very back.
Yeah, with that.
How do you write ethically about a primarily Indigenous community as a non-Indigenous author?
Ethically, I think that, well, first of all, I think my first answer would be a bold statement, which is you can write ethically about anything you want if it's from your perspective, which it is in both books. In terms of the larger question politically about, where we are right now, which is getting to be a better and better place in terms of speaking about the ethics of storytelling, I think that it only comes from this, my book cautions against good intentions, so my answer is still good intentions, but it is Alicia Elliott once said about 5 years ago, fine, write about Indigenous peoples so long as you truly love us. And you can take me to task if you don't think that I don't truly love the people I wrote about. And that's my only answer.
Okay, I think we've reached the end of our time for this evening. I need to remind everyone of the extremely important information that books are available for sale out in the lobby, and I believe that our readers tonight will be available to sign said books. Okay, so you've had your instructions. But before you go buy books, please join me in thanking once again Jen and Daryl and Elisa.
Sorry, I just, I've been asked to say a few things just as we wind up. First of all, echoing again, thanking everyone for attending tonight, and especially to our moderator and to the authors. Each of you have been wonderful in offering insights into not only your own process, but just some questions that I think are really essential to be asking and pondering as we consider as readers and as authors. As Nicholas has said, if you're interested in purchasing any of the books featured, please, they're available at Monroe's book table, and our authors will be able to sign them. Also, there are more festival events coming, so please refer to your program. Our website features Q&As with all the authors participating in the festival, and there's a place for you to sign up for our newsletter, so please do refer to the victoriafestivalofauthors.ca. If you'd like to support the festival in another way, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram and encourage your friends to attend one of our upcoming events. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to Victoria Festival of Authors through our website or on VFA's page at Canada Helps. Your donations help to keep our festival engaging, accessible, and sustainable. So just before, oops, I don't need that anymore. Just before you go, we have a raffle that we're going to draw, and I was told I was supposed to make this very dramatic. I'm not sure how to do that, but we have 2 draws to make. The first is for the books from tonight, and then I think the second one is for books, all of the books, the prose books from the festival. So for the first draw, I'll let you pick one. And it's number 051. Do we have? Woo! So the books are going to be outside on the table. Sorry, I should have said that. But congratulations. And then one more. No, go ahead.
You got the mic.
Go ahead.
088. Oh, that's the lucky side.
Okay. So thank you once again, and the books for the winners are outside on the table, and hope to see you at our events tomorrow. Good night. Thank you.